Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At my little sister's engagement dinner, right after the dessert hit the table, my mom leaned in close, just enough for me to feel the sharp edge in her voice, and whispered, "Don't you dare steal her spotlight with your news." I nodded, because what else do you do when your mother has already decided that your existence is a disruption, a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be embraced? I nodded, because I was tired of being the one who ruins everything, the one who walks into a room and makes it colder just by showing up. But deep down, I already knew that silence wouldn't save the night. Something was brewing, and it wasn't coming from me. Let me rewind just a bit, because to understand why that dinner ended the way it did, you have to know what it took for me to even show up at all. I hadn't been home in over a year. Not because I lived far, just 40 minutes away in a small apartment I'd never invited anyone to, but because home wasn't exactly the warm, nostalgic place other people seemed to crave during the holidays. Home, for me, was a landmine of old accusations and tense small talk, where everything nice said to my face felt dipped in sarcasm. I'd learned a long time ago that in our family, Samantha was the favorite, the chosen one, the one who never disappointed. And me? I was the cautionary tale. Samantha is 8 years younger than me, a picture-perfect bride-to-be with honey blonde hair, a killer Pilates routine, and the kind of warm, radiant presence that makes people hand her compliments like candy. She was the homecoming queen, the honors student, the first to get promoted, the first to get the ring. She didn't have to try, people just liked her. And my mother, Carol, practically worshipped her. My existence, by comparison, was messy. I was the one who dropped out of law school, the one who dated losers, the one who still hadn't settled down by 38. The one who made people uncomfortable. But tonight, I showed up with a plan. Not to steal anything. Not to stir up drama. Just to quietly, finally, share the news that had been sitting on my chest like an anvil for the past 4 months. I had breast cancer. I found the lump in April, went through all the blood work and the scans, sat in a fluorescent-lit room while a doctor said words that didn't make sense until they did. I was scheduled for surgery in less than 2 weeks. I hadn't told anyone in my family. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't find the space to. Every time I tried, something else took precedence. Samantha's promotion. Carol's minor back surgery that turned into a week-long saga. Jake's surprise trip to Paris for their anniversary. My problems always seemed to be bad timing. So when I got the invite to Samantha's engagement dinner, something in me thought, maybe this was the time. Maybe this was the moment to finally be honest. I'd been rehearsing the words in my head for days. I even brought a little envelope with a copy of my scan results, just in case I lost my nerve. And yet there I was, 5 minutes before the toast, my mother leaning over a crystal water glass, hissing, "Don't you dare steal her spotlight." It wasn't even a conversation. It was a warning. And it wasn't new. That voice, the one that said "you're too much, not now, maybe later," had been with me for as long as I could remember. So I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I knew nothing I said would matter. I figured I'd wait. Maybe pull Samantha aside later, after the photos, after the cake, after the glow had worn down just a little. Maybe then she'd see me. Maybe then she'd hear. Dinner was being held in the private room of some upscale rustic restaurant downtown, the kind with exposed brick and iron chandeliers, like it was trying a little too hard to look effortless. The long table was set with white linen and eucalyptus runners, and the whole thing smelled like roasted garlic and overpriced candles. Everyone was already a couple glasses deep into wine, laughing a little louder than usual, mostly pretending that nothing in the world could touch them. Jake, the groom-to-be, stood up near the head of the table, one hand casually brushing the back of Samantha's chair. He looked good. Too good. Clean shave, tailored navy blazer, that casual smugness some guys wear like cologne. People quieted automatically, raising their glasses as if they knew what was coming. I braced myself for the speech, the sweet cliches, the cheesy jokes, the part where he says Samantha changed his life. But then he paused. Not for dramatic effect. Not in that "I'm so in love I am overcome" way. It was the kind of pause that made your stomach tighten before your brain even caught up. Jake cleared his throat and said, "Before we celebrate, I need to come clean about something." Forks froze midair. My mother's smile dropped so fast I thought I imagined it. Samantha tilted her head just slightly, her hand still resting lightly on Jake's arm. Jake didn't look at her. He looked at me, and I felt the air leave the room. "Now, I need to ask you something, because this is where it gets messy. If you had a secret that could ruin someone's life, would you wait until the perfect moment? Or would you blurt it out, just to feel the weight lift from your chest? Have you ever sat at a dinner table with people you loved, knowing someone was about to destroy everything you thought was real?" Because that's exactly where I was. I hadn't even opened my mouth. But suddenly, the spotlight was on me anyway. And the worst part? I had no idea what he was about to say. For a few seconds after Jake said those words, "Before we celebrate, I need to come clean about something," there was a strange kind of silence, the thick, unnatural kind that falls in rooms where joy was just a second ago dancing in the air, but now, like a balloon punctured without warning, deflates into something stiff and uncertain. The sound of someone's knife slipping off a plate rang out louder than it should have, and somewhere to my left, Carol's breath caught, just loud enough for me to know she was already preparing for the worst, but still clinging to the ridiculous belief that if she smiled hard enough, nothing would break. Samantha, sitting beside Jake with her elbow lightly grazing his, looked up at him with that open, trusting expression that only people who still believe in permanence wear, a look that said she didn't see the bomb ticking in his eyes, but I did. God help me, I saw it the moment I walked in. Jake didn't stammer. He didn't blink too much. He didn't seem drunk or hysterical or overwhelmed. He just looked strangely calm, like a man who had been waiting for his own storm and had finally stopped running from it. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, had barely even acknowledged his engagement to my sister, but in that moment, I remembered the one thing that had always made me wary of him. He never said anything unless he already knew the impact it would have. Jake was deliberate, calculating in a way that passed as charm to most people, but to me had always felt like a carefully disguised threat. He used pauses the way most men used volume, every silence a loaded gun. He cleared his throat once more, gently tapped the side of his wine glass with a butter knife, and then, without looking at Samantha, said, "I haven't been completely honest. And I can't move forward with this engagement or this marriage until I put everything on the table." That was when I felt it, not just the tension in the room, but the shift in energy, the narrowing of attention, as if every single person seated around that white linen table had turned into a hawk circling above prey. No one moved. No one breathed. And still, Jake didn't look at Samantha. He looked at me. Not a glance, not a flicker. A full, direct stare, like a bullet heading for the chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The last time Jake had looked at me like that, we were both drunk, both stupid, and standing on the back patio of my friend Lauren's house in the middle of a party where he wasn't supposed to be without Samantha. That was almost 4 years ago. I had shoved it into a box in my mind, slammed it shut, and told myself it didn't mean anything. But seeing him now, I knew before he even opened his mouth what was about to come out. "I slept with Melissa," he said. No build-up. No apology. No explanation. Just 5 words that shattered the illusion faster than any explosion could have. For a split second, no one reacted. It was like people were still waiting for the punchline, as if maybe this was one of those cruel jokes men make when they've had too much to drink, when their charm curdles into arrogance. But then Samantha let out the tiniest sound, a soft, breathless exhale, like someone punched her in the stomach without touching her, and I saw her whole face change. Not anger, not even shock. Just confusion. Like someone had dropped a foreign object into her life, and she couldn't figure out how it belonged. Carol, to her credit, tried to recover first. She clapped her hands once, sharp and falsely cheerful, and said, "All right, Jake, I think that's enough wine for you." But Jake raised his hand and cut her off, still looking at me, still not blinking. "It wasn't recent," he said. "It was a few years ago. Before I proposed. We were on a break, Samantha and I was in a bad place. It only happened once. And that was when I realized he was doing it on purpose. Not just confessing. framing it, controlling the narrative, making sure the room heard it the way he wanted it heard, that he had been weak, sad, and alone, and I had been the convenient shoulder, the passive object in his story, the mistake. I could feel heat rise behind my ears, a slow simmering rage that didn't come from guilt, but from something deeper, from the knowledge that he was weaponizing the truth before I could even touch it. I opened my mouth to speak, but Samantha beat me to it. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice quiet, oddly detached, like she hadn't even processed the words yet. I looked at her, really looked at her. My sister, who used to climb into my bed after nightmares. My sister, who once punched a boy in the face when he called me names at the pool. My sister, who had become a stranger somewhere along the way, not because of what either of us had done, but because life had this cruel way of giving people roles they never auditioned for, and she had become the perfect bride, and I, the cautionary ghost. "Yes," I said, because there was no point in lying now. But then I added, slowly, carefully, but not how he's telling it. Jake narrowed his eyes, a flicker of panic crawling into his expression, and I saw, for the first time since he started talking, his mask crack. Carol stood up, gripping the edge of the table like it might hold her whole world in place, and said, "Melissa, for God's sake, if you had any decency." I looked at her then. Really looked. And I realized that for all her years of subtle digs and passive-aggressive remarks, this was the moment she feared the most, not because her daughter had slept with her other daughter's fiancé, but because now the mess was public. Because people were watching. Because the image of the perfect family was bleeding on the tablecloth in front of everyone. I turned to Jake and said, "You left out a lot." He took a step back, jaw tightening. "Do you want to tell them?" I asked, "or should I?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. And I thought, for the first time in a long time, that maybe I wasn't the weak one. Maybe I never had been. But as I opened my mouth to speak, to really tell the truth, Carol's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Not here. Not now." And that was the difference between us. She still believed timing could save everything. But I had learned the hard way. The truth doesn't care about timing. It shows up when it wants, ruins what it touches, and sometimes, it sets you free. Only no one at that table looked free. Not yet. And I hadn't even said what I came to say. There's a moment right after the truth is spoken out loud, when time seems to stretch and distort, like warm glass being pulled slowly into a shape it was never meant to hold. And in that moment, no one at the table said anything, no one moved. No one even dared to blink too loudly, as if any sudden gesture might shatter whatever fragile illusion remained after Jake's confession tore a gaping hole through the night. I had expected some gasps, maybe a few scattered outbursts, the kind of chaos that usually follows a family scandal, but what I got instead was worse. Stillness, cold and deafening. A suffocating silence that pressed on my chest with the weight of years' worth of resentment, regret, and unspoken anger. Samantha sat frozen, her back rigid and her hands clenched in her lap like a child trying not to cry in front of the adults, and for all the ways she had always seemed so put together, so polished and perfect and above emotional messes. She looked like she had been hollowed out in the span of a single sentence, her eyes wide and unseeing as if she'd been slapped, but couldn't quite register the pain. Jake stood beside her, his shoulders squared and face composed, still trying to play the role of the regretful but brave man who was doing the right thing, and yet every second that ticked by made his performance less convincing, his stance less noble, his face a little too rehearsed. And across from them, Carol sat down slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement people make when they realize they're no longer in control of the room and are trying to retreat behind the last weapon they have, silence. I should have stopped there. I should have taken the out. I could have let Jake's version stand, let everyone believe it was a one-time lapse in judgment, an unfortunate but forgivable mistake that happened years ago and didn't need to be dissected further. But the thing is, when someone tries to reduce your story to a footnote in their own redemption arc, when they spin your pain into their excuse for weakness, when they look you in the eye and pretend it was just one night, you realize staying quiet isn't graceful. It's complicit. And I'd been complicit for far too long. So I took a breath, held it for a beat longer than felt comfortable, and said softly, but clearly enough for every person at that table to hear he didn't tell you everything. Jake's eyes darted to mine, that flicker of panic resurfacing, and I knew then that no matter how polished his lie had been, he hadn't prepared for the possibility that I might refuse to stay in my designated role. Samantha turned to me slowly, her mouth slightly open, and though she didn't speak, her expression begged for an answer, begged for me to either confirm or deny the nightmare she was suddenly trapped in. I could have spared her. God knows I wanted to. But you can't protect someone with half-truths, and besides, I wasn't the one who broke her heart. That was Jake's legacy. It wasn't just once, I said, still staring at him, refusing to blink. It wasn't a drunken mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. It went on for months. The gasp that followed didn't come from Samantha. It came from Carol, whose knuckles were white against the stem of her wineglass, her face drawn into a hard mask of disbelief. Samantha, for her part, simply turned her face away, looking down at her plate as if trying to find refuge in the pattern of the ceramic. Jake shook his head, too fast, too rehearsed. "That's not true," he said quickly. "Melissa, come on, you know that's not what happened. We slept together once. That's it. We talked after, but..." Talked. I repeated, and this time, I laughed, not out of humor, but the bitter kind that crawls up from the pit of your stomach when someone tries to edit your trauma into their convenience. "You didn't just talk. You came to my apartment 3 nights a week for 2 months. You bought groceries. You took phone calls in my kitchen. You stayed over and told me you were confused and miserable and that she didn't understand you." The room reacted like I'd just detonated something beneath the table, and in a way I had. I hadn't planned to. That night, I really had meant only to share my own truth, the one that had nothing to do with Jake, the one I'd been carrying alone for months. But this truth, this part of the story, had been buried for so long under the weight of family expectations and fake smiles that it came out raw, aching, and impossible to swallow. Jake had gone pale. "We were broken up," he insisted, but his voice was weaker now, less certain. "Sam and I were on a break. But that didn't matter, and he knew it. The timeline wasn't the issue anymore. It was the lie, the sustained deception, the months of pretending nothing had happened, the engagement that followed. And the worst part? I let it happen. I didn't tell Samantha. I didn't warn her. I sat on the sideline and watched her plan a future with a man who had spent nights in my bed, saying things I knew he didn't mean but still needed to hear at the time. I justified it to myself. Told myself she'd moved on, that he'd chosen her, that it didn't matter anymore. But deep down, I'd known she deserved better. And I didn't say a word. Carol, now visibly shaking, turned her fury on me. "Why now, Melissa? Why would you bring this up now? Haven't you hurt your sister enough?" And that was the thing. No matter what I said, no matter what Jake did, I would always be the villain in Carol's story. I had ruined the evening. I had tainted the celebration. I had made everything messy. But for the first time, I didn't care. Because I wasn't done yet. I looked at Samantha, whose face was unreadable, and I said, quietly, "That's not even the secret I came here to tell." And, just like that, every eye returned to me. The room went still again. A different kind of silence now, not the stunned paralysis after a betrayal, but the suffocating anticipation of knowing that another wave was coming, and it was going to be even bigger than the last. I saw Jake stiffen, like he'd just remembered something, and his eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before: fear. I could feel it building, rising like a tide I couldn't stop anymore, and for the first time all night, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. There are moments in life when everything around you seems to blur into a background hum, when the room you're standing in feels both microscopic and infinite, when time folds over itself and your breath becomes the only thing anchoring you to the present. This was one of those moments, and as I sat there, under the relentless scrutiny of every eye in the room, I realized I had come to the edge of a precipice, one I had been moving toward slowly, reluctantly, and with no real plan for what would happen when I finally opened my mouth and let everything spill. I had come to Samantha's engagement dinner expecting to quietly share something painful and personal, something I had carried in secret out of fear, guilt, and a misguided belief that my family might, just this once, put aside their expectations and judgments long enough to see me for who I really was. But the night had derailed into a confession of past sins, old betrayals, and shattered illusions, and now that everything was in pieces on the table, I had one final truth left to offer, and unlike the others, this one didn't involve anyone's infidelity, no tangled sheets or old regrets. This one was about survival. Mine. I looked around that table, my eyes moving slowly from person to person, pausing briefly on Samantha, who still hadn't said a word since my last revelation and whose face was now completely void of expression, not cold, not angry, but emptied in that way people sometimes go when they've reached the absolute limit of what they're willing to feel. Jake sat rigid, like a man holding his breath in a minefield, hoping the next step wouldn't blow him apart. And then there was Carol, whose disapproval was practically vibrating off her skin, her fingers wrapped so tightly around the base of her wine glass that I half expected the stem to snap in half. But I wasn't looking for support, and I wasn't asking for understanding. I was beyond that now. What I wanted, what I needed, was the air, the space, the right to speak a truth that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with reclaiming what was left of me. So I exhaled slowly, deliberately, and with a voice that didn't tremble, I said, "For months ago, I found a lump." Carol flinched. A few people leaned in slightly as if they'd misheard. Jake looked confused, maybe thinking this was some kind of bizarre metaphor, some emotional appeal I was building up to before I returned to dragging him through the dirt. But I wasn't talking about him anymore. I wasn't even talking about the past. I didn't think much of it at first, I continued, letting the words flow at their own pace, not hurried, not rehearsed, just honest, raw, and without ornament. I figured it was nothing, maybe a cyst, maybe stress. But it didn't go away. So I went in for a scan. And then a biopsy. And then a follow-up. And eventually, I sat in a room alone while a doctor used words like invasive, early stage, and lumpectomy. There was a long pause, the kind that usually precedes polite condolences or awkward reassurances, but no one said anything. And in the stillness, I kept going. I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the end of April. I've been through 4 rounds of tests, I've met with 3 different specialists, and I'm scheduled for surgery in less than 2 weeks. I looked down for a moment, not because I felt ashamed, but because saying it out loud made it feel heavier, more real, like an anchor finally dropped after drifting aimlessly for too long. When I looked up again, I saw Carol shaking her head, her face hardening into something almost angry. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" she demanded, her voice sharp and wounded in that way she always managed to turn outward pain into a weapon aimed at others. "Why would you sit on something like this and let us find out like this?" I laughed then, soft and bitter, the sound of someone who's heard this play before and knows the lines by heart. "Because, Mom," I said, my voice steady but laced with quiet fury, "you told me not to steal her spotlight." She froze, mouth slightly open, caught in the trap she'd built with her own words. I watched the recognition bloom slowly across her face, the slow dawning horror that came with realizing this wasn't just about a messy romantic entanglement or an awkward family dinner. This was about a daughter who had been gaslighted into silence, who had been taught to make herself smaller every time something about her life made other people uncomfortable. "You said it right before dessert," I continued, not raising my voice, not needing to, because every syllable landed like a drop of ice water. "You leaned in, looked me straight in the eye, and said, 'Don't steal her spotlight with your news.' So I didn't." Samantha blinked, her expression shifting for the first time in what felt like forever, something soft and wounded breaking through the numbness. She opened her mouth, but didn't speak right away, and when she finally did, her voice was so low I had to lean forward to hear her. "You were going to tell us tonight?" "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I wasn't coming to stir the pot. I wasn't coming to rehash the past. I was coming to tell you I'm scared. I'm exhausted. And I didn't want to go into surgery without my family knowing what was happening." Jake finally spoke then, his voice low, almost contrite. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear, Melissa, I had no idea you were sick." I looked at him, long and hard, before I answered. "That's not entirely true," I said slowly, savoring the impact. You didn't know about the diagnosis. But you knew something was wrong. You ghosted me when I stopped responding to your late-night messages. You stopped asking how I was when I told you I was in and out of appointments. You disappeared the second I stopped being convenient. He tried to protest, but the damage was already done, and for once, the room was no longer interested in his version of the story. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd brought, the one with the test results, the one I'd printed and folded with shaking hands that morning, and placed it gently in the center of the table, like a final offering. No more secrets, I said. Not from me. No one touched it. Carol sat back, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable but clearly boiling beneath the surface, unwilling to offer sympathy and unable to admit fault. Samantha stared at the envelope like it might explode. And Jake? Jake just looked small. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. And I wasn't finished yet. The thing about revenge, real revenge, the kind that doesn't involve slashed tires or screaming matches or dramatic public takedowns, is that it rarely arrives with fanfare or fireworks. No, real revenge moves slowly, deliberately. Like water carving its way through stone, quiet but unrelenting, and by the time it reaches the surface, no one even remembers the day the first drop fell. That night, as I sat at the engagement dinner that had unraveled into a confession booth, a courtroom, and finally a battleground for everything this family had spent decades refusing to say, I realized something vital. What I wanted wasn't chaos or apologies or even vindication. What I wanted was truth. I wanted it in the open, under the harsh light of crystal chandeliers and brittle smiles, exposed like a nerve, unflinching and undeniable. Because only when the lies are dead can something else, anything else, begin. The envelope I had placed on the table, still unopened, seemed to radiate energy, like it held not just my diagnosis, but the very weight of the moment, and no one, not Samantha, not Carol, not Jake, seemed willing to reach out and touch it. Maybe they were afraid of what it symbolized, or maybe they were still too stunned to move. Either way, the silence that hung in the room wasn't the kind that invites peace. It was the kind that crackles with aftershocks, the kind that signals the ground has shifted for good. Carol, always the master of emotional redirection, finally stood and muttered something about needing air, pushing her chair back with the subtle violence only a mother deeply embarrassed can achieve, and as she walked away from the table, her spine ramrod straight. I saw the truth I had known my entire life written on her face. Control meant more to her than connection. She would rather preserve the image of a perfect family than face the reality of her broken daughters, and I was done performing the role she assigned me so many years ago, the rebellious one, the disruptor, the cautionary tale. Samantha, to her credit, stayed seated. She didn't cry, didn't lash out, didn't collapse into a mess of questions or accusations. Instead, she picked up her wineglass with slow, deliberate grace and took a sip, her eyes never leaving mine, and in that moment I saw not a victim, not a girl whose heart had been broken by the man sitting beside her, but a woman processing the truth brick by brick, dismantling the foundation of the life she thought she was building, and replacing it with something harder, something real. I knew that look. I'd worn it myself once, the day I realized no one was coming to save me and that the only thing left to do was save myself. Jake finally broke the silence. I never meant for this to happen like this, he said, and the words were so pitifully predictable I almost laughed. He sounded like a man trying to crawl his way back into the narrative, as if his regret should earn him a seat at the table again, as if his discomfort was the most urgent matter at hand. I was young. I was stupid. I didn't know what I wanted. You were 29, I said quietly, not 16. And you knew exactly what you wanted. You just didn't think you'd get caught. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped, the words dying in his throat when he saw I wasn't going to play the game anymore. There was no room left for performance, no benefit of the doubt to be given. He had spent years lying to Samantha, minimizing what he did, and now that the truth had caught up with him, there was nothing left to shield him from the consequences. That was when I reached into my bag one more time. Actually, I said, I wasn't completely honest either. Jake froze, and even Samantha raised an eyebrow. I pulled out my phone and tapped a few times, scrolling to a folder I had created 2 months ago, back when I started to feel the shift in Jake's messages, when he stopped being just a ghost from the past and started trying to rewrite history in real time. I placed the phone face up on the table and hit play. His voice filled the room instantly, clear, unmistakable, smooth with that practice charm that had once fooled us both. Hey, Melissa. Look, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know it's probably weird to hear from me, but I can't stop thinking about that night. About how it felt. About how maybe we left things unfinished. I don't know. Call me back. The message ended and no one spoke. I played the next one. Sam's great, don't get me wrong. She's everything on paper. But with you, it felt different. Like I could breathe. I miss that. I miss you. There were 3 more. I didn't need to play them. The point had been made. Jake's expression went gray, his mouth slack, as if someone had yanked the floor out from under him, and I watched as he reached for words and found none that could unring the bell. Samantha looked at the phone, then at Jake, and then back at me, and for a brief moment I saw the flicker of realization that this wasn't about a mistake from years ago. This was about now. This was about a man who had been emotionally cheating days before he planned to put a ring on her finger, and worse, who had been playing both sides with a coward's precision. And she didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. Instead, she stood up slowly, gracefully, and looked at him with the kind of gaze that speaks volumes without needing to raise a voice. I can't fix this for you, she said. And I don't want to. Then she walked away. Jake looked at me like I had just set his whole life on fire, and maybe I had, but I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel smug. What I felt was clean, like I had finally walked through the storm and stepped out on the other side stripped of everything false. I gathered my things in silence, tucked the envelope back into my purse, no one needed to touch it now, and gave one final look around the room. It was done. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, I was home recovering from my surgery, stitches tight, bruises blooming across my chest like dark flowers, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it expecting maybe a neighbor, maybe a package, but instead found Samantha standing there, her face bare, her hair pulled back, and in her hand was a small plastic bag from the pharmacy. Inside was a pregnancy test. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, she looked me in the eye and asked the one question I hadn't prepared for. Is it yours? And in that moment, I didn't know what to say. Because revenge, no matter how clever or justified, always has a cost. And sometimes, when the smoke clears, you realize the fire you lit didn't just burn them. It burned everything.